One sentence, one billionaire, one moment Congress couldn't erase. J.D. Vance didn't raise his voice that day. He didn't need to, because when he read that line, just 12 words long, the room full of senators, lobbyists, and cameras went completely still. No whispers, no objections, just silence. 17 seconds of it. In a place built on noise, ego, and scripted outrage, it was the quiet that said everything. What did he say? And why did it make one of America's most powerful men, backed by global empires and billion-dollar contracts, go pale? This isn't the version you'll find in transcripts or polished press releases. This is the emotional truth, told through a dramatized lens, but grounded in something very real. The weight of silence, the risk of speaking, and the line between power and accountability. The names, settings, and dialogue have been crafted for storytelling. But the feelings, the tension, the fear, the defiance, they're drawn from the world we all recognize. Because sometimes stories like this don't just imagine what happened, they reveal what almost did. So now ask yourself, what truth was too dangerous to ignore? Stay with us. This isn't just a story worth your time. It's one that might stay with you long after the final word. The package didn't come through the usual channels. There was no courier badge, no signature required, no digital receipt logged by the front desk. Just a plain, nondescript brown envelope, creased, smudged, slightly damp from the morning fog, sitting atop the stack of daily folders in Senator J.D. Vance's office. No sender, no postage. Just his name, typed, not written. No title, not senator. Just J.D. Vance. Emily, his senior legislative assistant, furrowed her brow as she picked it up. "That's odd," she murmured. J.D. was across the room, reviewing amendments for an agriculture bill. He looked up when he saw her freeze. "It wasn't scanned through mail security," she said. "Do you want me to?" "Open it," J.D. replied without hesitation. Inside were three things: a stack of dense legal documents, contracts, memos, footnotes laced with references to shell corporations and digital service agreements, a slim USB drive in a Ziploc bag, and one loose page, folded cleanly in thirds. On the outside in red ink, someone had written, "For eyes in Beijing only." The room seemed to still. Emily swallowed. This feels off. Should we report it to Intel? The ethics committee?" J.D. walked over. He didn't answer immediately. He studied the label again. 4 words that shouldn't have made it to a U.S. Senate desk. Then softly but firmly, he said, "No." We read it. He took the documents and sat down at the far end of the table, the seat he reserved for private strategy meetings, and for moments he didn't yet know how to define. Emily hesitated, then shut the door quietly behind her. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. Outside the window, the Capitol dome stood watch, as if it too were waiting. J.D. flipped the first page. Cloud River Technologies, Data Infrastructure Agreement, Internal Draft. He kept reading. Buried in paragraph 47 was a clause titled Redundancy and Access Protocols. It was standard corporate legalese, until it wasn't. All non-U.S. regional traffic routed through Southeast Asia is subject to mirrored compliance oversight. And then, in smaller print, third-party redundancy providers to be engaged through intermediary entities headquartered in Shenzhen. J.D. sat back. Shenzhen, the heart of China's tech manufacturing empire. He rubbed his thumb over the phrase as if to feel if it were real. The next memo was even more damning. A risk analysis report from an internal compliance team, flagging security vulnerabilities and raising questions about possible data replication outside U.S. jurisdiction. The final comment read, Recommendation: do not disclose structure to congressional liaisons at this stage. Risk: political misinterpretation. Political misinterpretation? J.D. leaned forward, elbows on the oak table, eyes locked on the pages. This wasn't just about some data farm or infrastructure contract. This was about access, control, quiet pathways, and someone had made sure this didn't reach any oversight body, until now. He glanced at the USB drive. For a brief second, he wondered, was this bait? A setup? But whoever sent this, they knew what mattered to him. Not headlines, not power plays, patterns, footprints, quiet betrayals wrapped in technical language. He plugged it in. A single folder appeared on the screen. No encryption, no password. Mirror docs for Asia. Inside, audio recordings. PowerPoint decks in Mandarin with English annotations. Screenshots of internal Slack messages. One of them, dated just 5 months earlier, read, "The Americans never read past the executive summary." Another, "This back door is clean. If it ever surfaces, we call it redundancy." JD's jaw tightened. He didn't say a word, but something in his eyes changed, honed, focused, the kind of stillness before a storm. A knock at the door broke the silence. Emily peeked in. "You okay?" JD looked up. His voice was low. "Get me the oversight committee calendar. We're going to have a hearing." And then, as if to himself, "No more quiet deals. Not on my watch." He didn't go home that night. After the door clicked shut and the hallway lights dimmed, JD remained at the table. Papers spread out like a war map. Each paragraph a landmine waiting to be uncovered. The USB had confirmed his fear, but it was the printed contracts that held the structure. The legal skeleton of something far more deliberate than poor oversight. He loosened his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and began reading, page by page. By page 74, his eyes burned. His highlighter had bled through 2 pages already. But there was something here, something layered in neutral language and buried beneath pages of compliance language, so sterile it almost passed unnoticed. And then he found it. Paragraph 112, subsection D, footnote 9. In the event of infrastructure failure in the primary jurisdiction, mirrored data continuity shall be maintained via authorized third-party nodes in Region 4. He paused, flipped back to the legend on page 3. Region 4, Southeast Asia. He flipped to the internal appendix. Region 4 routing protocols listed Shenzhen, Chengdu, and an unnamed satellite location marked CN Beta. JD sat perfectly still. He reread the sentence, then read it again, aloud this time, slowly, deliberately. Mirrored data continuity, third-party nodes in Region 4. His pulse began to rise. This wasn't just legal padding. This was architectural language, code for building parallel systems, systems that could be accessed, audited, or copied outside U.S. soil, outside congressional jurisdiction, and outside the public's knowledge. He reached for the file labeled Cloud River Supplemental Terms, tucked toward the back of the stack. And there it was again, dressed in softer phrasing. Redundancy partners may operate under alternate regulatory frameworks in accordance with regional compliance, unless superseded by explicit federal guidelines. No federal guidelines were cited. In the margin, in faint pencil, probably from the whistleblower, someone had written, "Translation, they're free to do whatever they want." JD stood, paced to the window, and stared out across the silent Capitol. Washington shimmered under artificial light. Monuments standing tall, traffic humming through the arteries of the city. It looked orderly from here, but under the surface, there were fractures. He thought of the town halls in Ohio, the steel workers, the factory clerks, the retired veterans who told him, time and again, that power didn't just disappear, it relocated. And it was always someone else who benefited. Someone with offshore accounts, shell partners, and non-disclosure clauses. This wasn't just bad policy, it was a backdoor, and someone had built it deliberately, with legal deniability baked into every paragraph. He walked back to the table and circled the clause in red. Then another. Then another. By the time he reached page 183, he had flagged 17 distinct redundancy permissions, all subtly structured to route access to entities that Congress had never vetted. He exhaled sharply, ran a hand through his hair. This wasn't noise, it was signal, coded carefully for anyone too tired or too busy to keep reading. He suddenly remembered what the internal message had said on the USB. The Americans never read past the executive summary. He picked up the front page. The summary was just 1.5 pages long, polished, sanitized, perfectly harmless. It was everything after that that screamed. Behind him, a wall clock ticked past midnight. He didn't notice. He was already pulling out a legal pad and scribbling notes for the next morning. The Oversight Committee hearing request, the staff briefings, the questions that no one had asked because no one knew what to look for. He paused just before the last note, wrote 4 words in capital letters. Not negligence. Structured access. Then circled it once. Hard. He looked back down at the stack of papers, the whistleblower's quiet pencil marks, the gaps deliberately left unguarded. You didn't miss this by accident, he whispered. You buried it. By the time morning light bled across the city skyline, the contract pages lay scattered across JD's desk like the debris of a quiet war. The sun didn't so much rise as seep into the room, low and cold, catching the edge of the red ink he'd circled through the night. He hadn't slept, but he didn't feel tired, just clear. Emily and Miles, his 2 most senior aides, entered the room quietly. They had known from the moment he'd texted 7 a.m., closed door, bring nothing, that this wouldn't be routine. He didn't ease into it. We go public, JD said, eyes still scanning the final page. I want a hearing. Emily's brows furrowed. A full oversight committee hearing? JD nodded. Live, open, and I want Wexler under oath. Miles looked between the documents. This is going to light fires. He has powerful friends. Tech, commerce, half the hill. JD looked up at them for the first time that morning. Then we bring flashlights. There was a beat of silence, the kind where conviction hangs heavy in the air. Then Emily reached for her notepad. Okay, logistics first. If we move today, earliest hearing slot is 10 days out. We'll need staff clearance, subpoenas, media control. Skip the media control, JD said. Let it breathe. Miles hesitated. You sure? That'll give Wexler time to spin it. JD nodded. Let him. The truth doesn't need a news cycle. It needs oxygen. Before anyone could respond, JD's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. A number with no name, but a city code he recognized. Georgetown. He answered. Senator Vance, the voice said. Low, calm, polished. Let me save you a headache. I know what you're looking at. I know where it came from. You've got ambition. I respect that. But this hearing, it'll make enemies. Real ones, JD's tone didn't change. Is that a warning? It's an invitation, the voice replied. To be smart. Let this slide. In 6 months, you'll chair your own subcommittee. You want change? We can help you make it happen. Quietly, strategically. JD stood, walked to the window again, looked out over the Capitol lawn, where school kids were starting their tours, where cameras were always watching, except when it really mattered. He held the phone a moment longer, then spoke clearly. You just confirmed everything I needed to know. And he hung up. Miles and Emily exchanged glances. JD turned back to them, jaw tight but eyes steady. Good, he said. That means we're close. In the stillness that followed, a quiet certainty settled in the room, like the pause before a storm makes landfall. There would be backlash. He knew that. Doors would close. Calls would stop being returned. He might even lose committee leverage, future endorsements, political favors carefully built over years. But none of that outweighed the truth. Not this time. Not when the betrayal was engineered so precisely and tucked behind the kind of legal veneer that counted on no one reading beyond the summary. He walked to his bookshelf, pulled out a worn, hardcover copy of the Federalist Papers, and flipped it open. Tucked inside was a small, handwritten note, something his grandfather had given him after law school. If your voice shakes the room, don't apologize. Speak louder. JD looked at the clock. 7:32 a.m. Let's draft the hearing notice, he said. Time to open the door. While JD's office began preparing subpoenas and press briefings across the river in a glass-paneled skyscraper 32 floors above K Street, another kind of preparation was already underway. Daniel Wexler had built his name like most modern tech legends, fast, bold, and camera-ready. He dropped out of Stanford at 21, not because he was struggling, but because he was bored. College moves too slow for people building the future, he once told Forbes with a smirk. That line made the cover. By 25, he'd launched Cloud River, a hybrid infrastructure firm promising freedom through speed, a slogan as empty or profound as anyone wanted it to be. The company started as a secure file-sharing service, but within 5 years it had become the invisible skeleton of half the U.S. internet: cloud computing, server routing, and enterprise data storage wrapped in glossy branding and bulletproof contracts. Wexler had a gift for language, for avoiding questions without ever seeming evasive. At congressional tech briefings, he often sat forward, smiling, jacket unbuttoned, dropping buzzwords like breadcrumbs for the press. We don't store data. We store possibility. We don't compete globally. We connect globally. Our allegiance is to innovation, and the American dream. Those lines landed well. What didn't land, what never even surfaced, were the silent mergers buried inside his empire. In 2016, Cloud River quietly absorbed a Singapore-based firm with long-standing partnerships in mainland China. In 2018, it restructured licensing rights through an Irish shell company, redirecting contract enforcement to the Cayman Islands. And in 2020, a small firm based in Shenzhen, publicly labeled a redundancy partner, was granted access to over 22% of Cloud River's global server mirror logs. That wasn't public knowledge. Not yet. Publicly, Wexler donated to veteran scholarships, sponsored STEM programs, and gave standing ovations at military galas. He was photographed with 3 presidents, 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, and received the National Tech Award for advancing American sovereignty in the digital age. Privately, sovereignty had a price, and he'd learned long ago how to make it negotiable. In the early days, friends described him as curious, ruthless but charming. By his 30s, even close associates admitted there was something calculated beneath the charm, something watching, measuring, waiting to make the next move before you even realized you were on a board. He kept a single photo on his office wall, a black and white shot of the first Cloud River server in his garage. Below it, a gold plaque read, "Control the flow, and the river bends to you." His executives often laughed at that line, but they also repeated it, quietly in meetings that mattered. By 2022, Wexler's network extended far beyond tech. Defense contractors, former State Department officials, energy consultants, they all showed up at Cloud River events. The company's annual retreat took place in Aspen, or sometimes Bali. No press allowed. When rumors of foreign routing partners surfaced in a niche cybersecurity blog in late 2023, Wexler's team dismissed them as conspiratorial nonsense. The post was pulled within 48 hours. The blogger never wrote again. What made Wexler dangerous wasn't that he had power. It was that he made power look polished, trustworthy, American. The emails JD had found didn't show panic. They showed confidence. The kind that grows when you've evaded scrutiny for so long, you forget scrutiny is even possible. Back in his high-rise office, Wexler stood before a mirror, adjusting his tie. His calendar was light that day, one briefing in the afternoon, a private call with a lobby group that evening. Then his assistant knocked lightly and entered. "Sir, you may want to see this. Senator VANCE just filed a hearing notice." Wexler's hands stilled. He blinked once. Slow. He murmured, then smiled faintly. "Let's make sure we're ready." He turned to the window. From here, the Capitol looked small. Wexler had smiled in the mirror that morning. But halfway across town, inside a dull, unmarked office suite tucked behind the Capitol's west wing, a different kind of reflection was forming, one stitched from transaction logs, cross-border filings, and redacted business registrations. JD had quietly commissioned a side review, a digital trace pulled by 2 former intelligence analysts, now working under private contract. They worked fast. The data moved faster. Within 48 hours, the outline of something darker began to emerge. The first flag came from Singapore. A subsidiary called Argo Delta Solutions, listed as a cloud infrastructure consultant, had executed 5 contracts with Cloud River in the past 4 years. On the surface, they were routine: consulting, compliance audits, regional scaling. But Argo Delta didn't exist in Singapore's corporate registry. Not really. It had no public office, no staff list, no verifiable tax ID. Instead, it was tied to a Hong Kong holding firm, Sable Crest Ventures, which itself was linked through layered transactions to Hantech Digital, a data routing company with past partnerships in mainland China. Hantech had been flagged by the U.S. Commerce Department in 2021 for its ties to banned telecom infrastructure projects in Eastern Europe and South America. JD leaned back in his chair as the findings landed, line by line. Wexler's empire wasn't just sophisticated, it was engineered to be invisible. The deeper they dug, the more precise it became. A shell company in Mauritius routed billing through Dubai. A temporary licensing firm in the Isle of Man authorized domain transfers. Offshore directors changed every fiscal quarter. And then there was the board. Cloud River's own. Two names stood out immediately. The first, Li Wen, officially listed as Global Markets Advisor, a former executive at Hualinet, a Chinese telecom conglomerate blacklisted by the U.S. for its role in state surveillance projects. The second, Dr. Mei Zhao, a cybersecurity expert who had authored papers on dual-channel access frameworks, a term JD now recognized from the contract footnotes. Both held non-voting board seats, but they also held quiet influence, advisory veto power over foreign data continuity partnerships, language that wasn't even in Cloud River's public charter. JD stared at the printouts. The connections weren't theoretical anymore. They weren't accidental. This wasn't a loose oversight or a sloppy licensing agreement. It was an architecture, designed to mask access, obscure ownership, and route control through jurisdictions where questions rarely had answers. He stood from the table, paced once across the floor, and looked out the narrow Senate window. The city was humming below. Traffic, routine, business as usual. "This is no longer about business," he muttered, his voice quiet but resolute. "It's national security." Emily looked up from her laptop. "Do we go public with the board ties?" JD shook his head. "Not yet. If we move too fast, he'll know what we know. I want him comfortable." Miles, seated across the room, added carefully, "This will ripple. He has backing across 3 federal committees, 2 tech PACs, even some national defense think tanks." JD turned slowly, then let it ripple. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he continued, more to himself than anyone else. "If they're building pipelines out of our data, if we can't see where it's going or who's reading it, we're not just bleeding sovereignty. We're handing it over and calling it innovation." The room settled into silence. They weren't chasing fraud anymore. They were chasing something embedded, protected, and dangerous. From that point forward, JD's tone shifted, not just in language, but in presence. Gone was the cautious policymaker. What remained was something sharper, unyielding, and in his mind one question kept replaying. How long had they counted on no one asking the right questions? By the end of the week, JD's team had enough to move forward, on paper, but the final confirmation, the piece that stripped away even the thinnest veil of doubt, didn't come from a memo or a database. It came from a voice. Saturday evening, a parking lot 3 blocks south of the Navy Yard, half lit by a flickering security lamp and surrounded by silent, closed storefronts. JD waited in an old sedan with government plates removed. No aides, no press, no protection detail. Just a coat collar turned up against the wind and a file folder resting on his lap. At 7:08 p.m., she arrived. She didn't walk up right away, just stood by her car across the lot watching him, hesitating. Then slowly, with the quiet caution of someone who'd practiced this moment in her head a dozen times, she stepped forward. She looked younger than he expected, mid-30s maybe, but her eyes said she hadn't slept properly in months. "Senator," she said softly. JD nodded. "You worked in compliance?" She nodded once. 3 years. Internal Audit Division. I left last fall." He motioned gently for her to sit in the passenger seat. She did carefully, like sitting in someone else's memory. For a few moments, there was only the sound of distant traffic and the buzz of that weak overhead light. "We flagged inconsistencies," she began, voice low. "Third-party partners that didn't pass baseline screening. But when we added China to the escalation list, it got removed. The head of policy told us directly, 'Don't flag that country. Just route and clear. JD didn't interrupt. He just listened. The weight of her words did the work. They told us to never flag that country in the report, she continued. And we knew what that meant. We knew what it meant. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a thin folder. Her hands shook. Not dramatically, but just enough for him to notice. I wasn't supposed to keep this. They wipe everything after every quarter. But I printed it, just in case. He opened the folder. Inside, one page. An email chain between Cloud River's vice president of infrastructure and a contractor based in Hong Kong. Most of the thread was logistical, codes, schedules, server notes. But the last line stood alone, unindented, bolded for emphasis. As long as Congress doesn't know, we're fine. JD stared at the line. Not because it was shocking, but because it wasn't. It confirmed what the documents hinted at, what the partnership suggested, what the legal footnotes danced around with practiced precision. It was never accidental. It was strategy. He folded the paper and slid it into his folder. What happens if this goes public? He asked. She looked down. They'll discredit me. Say I misunderstood. Maybe worse. You sure about this? She met his eyes. I'd rather lose my career than keep pretending we didn't see it. He nodded slowly. You won't be forgotten. She opened the door, hesitated. Neither will you if you go through with this. Then she stepped out and vanished into the shadows, leaving only the faint scent of cold night air and a truth too dangerous for daylight. JD didn't move. He sat there a while, staring at the single sentence glowing in his mind like a brand. As long as Congress doesn't know, he whispered to himself, voice firm and steady. Now it does. By Monday morning, the pressure had a name. It didn't come in the form of angry emails or front-page headlines. Not yet. It came in the form of quiet phone calls, redirected messages, and missed appointments. The hearing date had been set for 10 days out, but in Washington, 10 days was enough time to build a war or bury one. JD noticed it first when a Republican colleague, someone who'd once co-sponsored a digital transparency bill with him, suddenly went quiet. They passed each other in the hallway outside Judiciary. JD nodded. The man didn't nod back. At first, JD chalked it up to routine distraction. But then the second senator called, and the third, all with the same tone, polite concern cloaked in veiled warning. Hey, JD, I've been hearing things. Wexler's not just some tech guy. He's got deep roots. Maybe pull it back a bit. You've made your point. I'm hearing there's a committee slot for you. Commerce, maybe. You don't want to waste that over one hearing. Then came the lobbyists. They didn't call JD directly. They called the senators around him, staffers, chiefs of staff, PAC representatives. They called everyone except him, and their message was clear. If this hearing moves forward, we move our support elsewhere. Cloud River's allies began drafting op-eds. Political theater, one headline read. Anti-innovation populism, said another. One TV commentator laughed openly. Senator Vance thinks he's cracked some global conspiracy. What he's cracked is Silicon Valley's patience. JD's own staff started noticing donors backing away. One of their tech policy briefings was canceled without explanation. A scheduled meeting with a trade association vanished from the calendar overnight. Then came the hardest blow. Senator McKenzie, an old ally from across the aisle, someone JD trusted, walked into his office unannounced. She closed the door. Her voice was low, not angry, almost tired. JD, I'm pulling out. I can't back this hearing. I've got 3 defense grants tied to Cloud River infrastructure. If I support this, it all goes cold. He didn't speak right away. She continued, you're going to lose leverage, influence, momentum. It's political suicide. That word hung in the air longer than it should have. JD stood, walked over to the window. It had rained earlier. Water streaked the glass, bending the Capitol dome into something warped and abstract. He turned back to her, his voice calm. Good, he said. Then I'll walk alone. She blinked. You don't mean that. I mean exactly that. There was no drama in his tone, no performance, just clarity, the kind that scares people more than shouting ever could. After she left, Emily came in with a post-call briefing, A national tech lobby had just pledged a $2 million PAC donation to 3 senators, the same 3 who'd just withdrawn support from JD's data privacy bill. The message couldn't be clearer. Miles leaned in from his desk. They're trying to ice you out. Freeze the whole thing before Wexler even walks into the hearing. JD didn't answer at first. Then he pulled out the copy of the email the whistleblower had given him and laid it flat on the table. As long as Congress doesn't know, we're fine. He tapped the words gently. They built this knowing we'd blink, that we'd choose comfort over confrontation. Emily spoke up. So what do we do? JD looked at both of them. His voice was steady. We don't blink. And with that, the plan moved forward. The witness list was finalized. Subpoenas confirmed. The hearing room reserved. The pressure campaign was loud. But beneath it, something even louder was forming. The sound of someone not backing down. The noise of Washington didn't follow him home, but its weight did. It was nearly 8:30 p.m. by the time JD walked through the front door of their townhouse. The lights in the living room were soft. A pot of chili simmered on the stove, and an old James Taylor song drifted from the kitchen speaker. The kind of scene that should have felt like comfort. Instead, it felt like contrast. His wife, Charlotte, was already setting 2 bowls on the table. She looked up, her eyes immediately scanning his face. You ate lunch today? She asked, already knowing the answer. JD dropped his briefcase by the door and slipped off his coat. If coffee counts. She didn't smile. They sat down across from each other. The spoon clinked gently against the edge of her bowl. JD stirred his without taking a bite. I saw the press release, Charlotte said finally. The hearing's real now. It's public. He nodded. It's moving fast, faster than I expected. She leaned back slightly. And the backlash? He hesitated, then answered plainly. It's coming. Fast too. Charlotte reached for her glass. They've started calling me, not journalists, lobby reps, old friends who suddenly want to reconnect. All of them saying the same thing. This won't end well for you. JD looked up, eyes tired but locked in. They're not wrong. But you're still gonna do it. He nodded. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was familiar. A kind of shared stillness they'd built through campaigns, late-night crises, and election night losses. She'd seen him tired before, frustrated, wounded even. But this was different. You're not sleeping, she said softly. You carry it when you walk. You carry it when you speak. He put down his spoon. Because it's not about me anymore, he said. It's about the people who trusted us not to sell them off. She didn't respond right away, so he continued, slower this time. There's a steel plant in Ohio that shut down last year. I met a welder named Marcus. Tough guy, arms like iron, 3 kids. Told me the shutdown happened 2 weeks after Cloud River took over the data systems for their logistics provider. Jobs vanished, orders rerouted overseas. He asked me, did someone sell us without telling us? I didn't have an answer then. He exhaled, stared at the steam rising from the bowl between them. Now I do. Charlotte's eyes welled slightly, but she blinked it back. And what happens if they come for you? Really come for you? JD leaned forward, elbows on the table. Then at least they'll have to do it out in the open. For a moment she just watched him. Then she reached across the table, rested her hand on his, and gave it a small squeeze. Then don't flinch. He didn't say anything, but in that silence something inside him steadied. He wasn't just walking into a hearing, he was walking into fire, with no illusions, no backup, and nothing left to shield himself but the truth and the names of people who'd never make it into the news. The kitchen timer went off. The spell broke. Charlotte stood, grabbed 2 glasses from the cabinet, and poured a little wine. If they're going to come after you, she said with a quiet smile, you'll need more than chili. JD let out the first real laugh in days, soft, low, and honest. For a few minutes the Capitol could wait, but the fire inside him, it wasn't going out. The next morning JD arrived at the Capitol earlier than usual. The light outside was barely blue, and the corridors still smelled faintly of overnight floor polish. He didn't stop for coffee, didn't chat with staff. He walked straight into his office, shut the door behind him, and sat at his desk with a single document waiting in front of him. Subpoena number 47-118. Recipient, Daniel Wexler, CEO of Cloud River Technologies. Subject, public testimony before the Senate Oversight and Investigations Committee. Date, 10 days from now. Format, live, under oath. No counsel representation during primary questioning. Miles and Emily stood quietly near the door. Neither said a word as J.D. picked up the pen, signed the bottom corner in black ink, and slid the paper into a cream-colored envelope marked Hand Delivery, Office of Legal Counsel. Emily stepped forward. "Do you want us to notify the press office first?" J.D. shook his head. "Let them hear it from the other side. That way it lands louder." By noon, the subpoena had reached Cloud River's legal department, and by 2:17 p.m., Wexler's office responded, not with a formal statement, not with a legal objection, but with a smirk, delivered through a media leak to one of the major political newsletters. A junior spokesperson for Wexler was quoted, "Senator Vance's obsession with conspiracy over innovation is disappointing, but not surprising. We'll gladly participate in his hearing, and we'll make a spectacle out of his overreach." When J.D. read it, he didn't blink. He pushed his chair back, stood slowly, and walked out into the hallway. A CNN camera crew was waiting near the rotunda, completely unplanned, or perhaps not. They called out to him as he passed. "Senator Vance, is it true that you've subpoenaed Daniel Wexler personally?" He stopped, turned, and faced the cameras. His voice was steady. "Yes, I've issued a subpoena for Mr. Wexler to appear before Congress and answer questions under oath regarding his company's foreign partnerships and data practices." The reporter followed quickly. "His team says they'll make a spectacle of your overreach. Do you have a response?" J.D. didn't smile, didn't posture. He simply said, "This isn't about spectacle. It's about sovereignty. And no, this isn't overreach. This is oversight, something Congress was elected to do and something this country deserves." He paused, just for half a beat, just long enough to let the words settle, then added more quietly, "They want a spectacle? Fine, we'll make history." The clip ran within the hour. By evening, J.D.'s words were trending on X and Facebook. A few called him reckless. Others called him brave. But all of them were watching now. Inside Wexler's office, the mood had shifted. The casual confidence was still there, but now it was laced with strategy. His legal counsel began preparing for optics. His PR team compiled sound bites. And Wexler? He poured himself a drink, leaned against his balcony railing, and stared out at the Capitol under twilight. "They never learn," he said softly. "They want fire, but don't expect to get burned." Back in J.D.'s office, Emily returned with the final confirmation. "It's done. He's been formally notified." J.D. nodded, still staring out the window. The city buzzed below, cars threading through power and distraction. "Good," he said. "Now we let the country listen." 10 days later, the hearing room looked less like a chamber of inquiry and more like the front row of a national reckoning. The line of media trucks started forming at dawn. By 8 a.m., the side corridors of the Capitol overflowed with reporters, interns, aides, and camera crews jostling for angles. Photographers knelt, phones hovered, headlines were already being written before a single word had been spoken. Inside, the room was standing room only. Every seat was filled. Staffers leaned against the back wall. The air itself felt dense, not loud but pressurized like a storm cell about to break. J.D. sat at the head of the committee table, flanked by two subcommittee chairs. His expression was unreadable, shoulders relaxed, eyes still. In front of him sat a single folder. No stack of notes, no tablets, just the pages that mattered. At 9:02 a.m., the door opened. Daniel Wexler entered like he was walking onto a tech conference stage. Tailored navy suit, subtle cufflinks, confident smile. He was flanked by three lawyers, two from his in-house counsel, one from a private firm known for crisis management and corporate shielding. They moved with the coordinated ease of people used to power, not begging for it, but managing it. He approached the witness table, paused, and adjusted the microphone like it belonged to him. The clicking of cameras surged. Reporters leaned forward. In that single moment, the illusion of corporate invincibility returned, polished, poised, untouchable, until J.D. spoke. Mr. Wexler, this hearing is now in session. Please be advised you are under oath. Any falsified statement, omission, or evasion will be treated as obstruction before Congress. Wexler nodded politely. Understood, Senator. J.D. glanced briefly at his folder, then closed it. Let me be clear from the start, he said, voice calm but carrying. This is not about innovation. This is not about market disruption. And this is not about profit. He looked up directly into Wexler's eyes. This is about sovereignty. The room held its breath. J.D. continued. It's about the unseen infrastructure beneath our government, our economy, our communication. It's about who holds the keys when the system falters. And it's about the cost, hidden, exported, and signed in silence, of allowing that power to be rerouted without public knowledge or congressional oversight. Wexler didn't flinch. He smiled faintly, as if the words were expected. One of the journalists in the back whispered, "He came to play." J.D. went on. You're here today not as a CEO, but as a citizen, one whose company holds the cloud contracts for 7 federal agencies and whose board includes individuals with ties to entities banned from U.S. tech partnerships. There was a murmur. Someone's phone vibrated on a desk. A lawyer leaned over and whispered something to Wexler, who nodded without looking away. J.D. turned to his fellow committee members. You'll hear a lot today about redundancy, about compliance, about industry standards, but I ask that you listen between the lines. Because this story didn't begin with a contract. It began with a decision, the decision to place convenience over caution. And now we're here to ask the questions that were never meant to be asked. He leaned back slightly. Mr. Wexler, let's begin with your definition of redundancy partners. In plain English, no legal filters. Wexler adjusted his microphone again, slower this time. Redundancy partners are third-party systems used to ensure continuity in the event of domestic infrastructure failure. They're common, essential even. J.D. nodded. And do you confirm that some of those partners operate from jurisdictions outside the United States? A pause, then Wexler replied, That's a matter of regulatory interpretation. J.D. tilted his head. We'll come back to that. The temperature in the room seemed to shift. Not physically, but in energy. The illusion of control was starting to tilt, however slightly. And for the first time that morning, Wexler blinked. The early exchanges followed a script. Wexler answered with practiced ease. Definitions rolled off his tongue. Redundancy, interoperability, jurisdictional variance, phrased with just enough ambiguity to shield him. He spoke like someone who had rehearsed this moment with 3 attorneys and 2 communications consultants. His voice was calm, modulated, non-threatening. But J.D. wasn't in a rush. He let Wexler ease into comfort. Let the lawyers behind him relax, shift in their chairs, whisper confidently to one another. Let the room forget, for just a moment, who was in control. Then J.D. turned the page in his folder. Mr. Wexler, he began slowly, can you confirm whether Cloud River has any existing data continuity partnerships with firms headquartered in Shenzhen? Wexler kept his expression neutral. To my knowledge, Cloud River works with global service providers that meet international standards of security and reliability. We do not partner directly with any Chinese firms. J.D. didn't respond. He waited. Wexler shifted slightly. If there are subcontracts routed through foreign subsidiaries, they are handled at the infrastructure operations level. I do not personally oversee those details. J.D. tilted his head slightly, as if examining a museum artifact. So your position is that Cloud River has no direct ties to Shenzhen-based routing entities? Wexler nodded. Correct. J.D. looked down for a moment, then carefully lifted a page from his folder and held it up with 2 fingers. Then let's take a look at this internal email, dated October 17th, 2023, 3:42 a.m., originating from your inbox, addressed to your COO, flagged as priority eyes only. Wexler blinked. J.D. read aloud, his voice clear and unhurried. Have the CN Beta team proceed with the dual route overlay before the Federal Review Panel. Just don't tag it under the U.S. audit pathway yet. We'll classify it later under redundancy. A pause. The room held its breath. Wexler's lawyer leaned forward and whispered something sharply, but Wexler didn't move. His eyes were locked on JD, expression unchanged, but a flicker, small and sharp, passed through his gaze. That's not what it sounds like, he said after a beat. This was part of a broader infrastructure risk mitigation plan, not a covert routing operation. JD didn't break eye contact. And yet, he said quietly, the email came from your account. The timestamp matches a session login from your primary IP address in DC, and the CN Beta team, as you know, is a project division headquartered in Shenzhen, operating under a parent firm whose registration was quietly transferred to a Hong Kong holding company 6 weeks prior. He let the silence hang. Wexler opened his mouth, then closed it. The lawyers behind him shifted uncomfortably. Senator, Wexler finally said, voice firmer, with all due respect, I believe you're mischaracterizing standard enterprise operations for political effect. JD leaned in slightly. And I believe you're characterizing national security risk as a filing error. A flicker of audible reaction rippled through the gallery behind the press line. Cameras clicked. Some of the reporters stopped typing and simply stared. Wexler adjusted his tie. I'd like to confer with my counsel. JD didn't stop him. Take your time. We'll be here. Wexler turned to the lawyer behind him, speaking in whispers. But JD could tell. Something had shifted. The air around the witness table was no longer composed. It was tactical, defensive. Emily passed a new folder down to JD. He didn't open it yet. He didn't need to. Because this part, the moment of pivot, was never about data. It was about trust. And once that thread snapped in public view, no email could rewind it. JD sat back, letting the pressure build. Let's move on to the audit access logs from your third quarter compliance filings. I'd like to know why the Shenzhen server name was manually delisted 2 days before the Senate briefing began. Wexler's jaw stiffened, and for the first time since stepping into that room, he didn't have a prepared answer. Wexler hadn't answered the last question. His jaw tightened, his lips parted slightly as if preparing a rebuttal. But nothing came. Not immediately. His lawyers leaned forward, ready to interject. JD waited. No rush. No need to press. Sometimes the loudest proof was what wasn't said. But JD wasn't finished. He reached into the folder Emily had passed him moments earlier and pulled out a single printed page, one that hadn't yet been read into the record. The paper was unmarked, no stamp, no header. Just a screenshot. A captured internal chat exchange from a Slack-style platform. The file had come from the whistleblower's USB. JD placed the page flat on the table in front of him, then slowly lifted it for the room to see. This document, he said calmly, is dated July 28th of last year. It's part of an internal conversation between 2 Cloud River engineers, one US-based, one offshore, routed through a secondary domain not registered with the FCC. He looked at Wexler. You're CC'd on the thread. Wexler blinked once. JD continued, his voice even, unforced, but unmistakably cutting through the air like glass. Here's the line in question. It appears near the bottom of the transcript. I'll read it slowly for the record. He glanced at the page again, then began. The U.S. won't notice if we copy data traffic for backup. Their lawmakers can't read code. The words hung like smoke. No one moved, no one breathed. Not a shuffle, not a cough, not even the click of a camera. Even the lights seemed to pause. Across the table, Wexler sat frozen. The color in his face shifted. Not red, not pale. Just still. As if the air had been sucked from the room and there was nothing left to animate the mask he'd worn all morning. JD didn't press the moment. He didn't repeat the quote. He didn't need to. A full 7 seconds passed before anyone dared speak. It wasn't JD. It wasn't Wexler. It was Senator Mallory, an old war veteran from Kentucky who rarely said much during tech hearings. He leaned forward slightly and muttered into his microphone. Not loudly, but enough to cut the silence. Did he just admit to cyber espionage? A wave of energy swept through the gallery. Reporters sat up. Staffers exchanged glances. One of Wexler's attorneys abruptly stood and leaned down to whisper, fast, urgent, into his client's ear. Wexler didn't respond, He was staring at the sentence still held between JD's fingers. That single line, the one that had never been meant to leave the server room, the one that assumed no one in government would bother to understand what redundancy really meant. JD stood. His voice, when he spoke again, was deeper now. Not louder, just heavier, with something personal, something rooted in more than procedure. This wasn't just oversight, he said, looking out over the room. This wasn't some clerical misstep or misinterpreted clause. He let the paper drop to the table. It was betrayal, funded by silence, hidden behind partnerships no one dared question, and today we finally pulled that silence into the light. He looked directly at Wexler one last time. You didn't just move data, you moved power. No rebuttal came, no spin, no interruption, just a room full of people staring at a man who'd finally run out of code to hide behind. 17 seconds passed before the gavel struck to adjourn for recess. 17 seconds of silence, and for the first time in years, it wasn't because someone had nothing to say. It was because they'd finally heard everything they needed to. The silence inside the hearing room didn't last. It never does. By the time JD returned to his office, the first clip had already aired. CNN ran the quote as a banner headline. The U.S. won't notice if we copy data traffic. Within minutes, MSNBC, Fox News, and even late-night comedy shows had picked it up. Some played it with dramatic voiceovers. Others layered it with graphics of blinking code, Chinese flags, or the Capitol burning in CGI flames. But no matter the spin, the sentence was everywhere. On social media, the wildfire spread faster. By nightfall, the hashtag #JoshDigitalBetrayal was the #1 trend on X. The full 41-second clip of JD reading the line had been reposted over 6 million times across platforms, with captions ranging from, "Finally someone said it," to "Wexler should be arrested yesterday." JD's inbox was flooded, not just with news alerts or staff updates, but with messages. Thousands of them. Some were from average Americans. "You don't know me, but my son works in defense contracts. Thank you for protecting what the rest of us never get to see. I've voted the other way all my life, but after today, I'm behind you." Others, as were darker. "You better watch your back, Senator. You just made a lot of powerful enemies. We know where your kids go to school." Emily and Miles filtered the death threats immediately and passed them to Capitol Police. JD didn't respond to them, but he didn't ignore them either. He kept one on his desk, not out of fear, but as a reminder of the weight of what truth costs. By 7 p.m., JD was scheduled for a closed-door security briefing. The Capitol Police had increased his detail. A quiet suggestion came from the sergeant-at-arms. Relocate his family to a temporary location for a few days. Charlotte didn't protest. She had expected it the moment she saw the clip play in the background of the grocery store checkout line. Still, through all the noise, something strange was happening. For every headline that questioned JD's motives, 3 others called it the hearing of the decade. Editorials began using phrases like the line that split the silence and the sentence that rebooted oversight. Even JD's political opponents were forced to comment. Senator Kirsch, who had previously dismissed the inquiry as tech fear-mongering, released a cautious statement. "If what Senator Vance has presented is accurate, we must treat it with the full seriousness national security demands." JD watched the statement roll across the news crawl with a quiet, wry smile. A month ago, Kirsch had been photographed shaking hands with Wexler at a gala. By late evening, JD finally sat in the darkened corner of his office. The sun had set. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the television playing muted coverage in the background. Emily entered, holding her tablet. "They want you on 5 Sunday shows, 2 networks, 1 late night." JD raised an eyebrow. "And the others?" She smiled. "They're trying to figure out how they missed this?" He didn't answer right away, just leaned back, hands folded behind his head, the image of Wexler's frozen face still etched in his memory. "We didn't beat him with volume," JD murmured. "We beat him with 1 sentence." Emily nodded. "And now the whole country is listening." He exhaled slowly, the chaos of the day settling around him like static. But even in the noise, something was clear. This wasn't the end. It was only the middle, And somewhere behind the screens and hashtags and talking heads, someone else was already preparing the next move. The morning after the hearing, JD received a note, not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten note, delivered by a junior staffer in a plain envelope. Room 324, 6:30 p.m. Just a conversation. GJD didn't need a last name. There was only one senator who still used handwritten notes in a building run on encrypted servers and managed optics. Senator Graham, chairman of the Commerce Committee. Old guard. Charming when he needed to be. Deadly when it counted. His specialty wasn't confrontation, it was containment. At 6:27 p.m., JD walked into room 324, a rarely used office off the Capitol's East Wing. No cameras, no windows, just a heavy table, 2 chairs, and a glass decanter of scotch set neatly between them. Graham was already there, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, just enough to suggest friendliness. "Have a seat, JD. No aides. Just us." JD sat, not speaking. Graham poured 2 fingers of scotch into a glass and slid it across the table. "You've had a hell of a week. Country's lit up like Times Square. You should be proud." JD didn't touch the drink. "You didn't call me here to congratulate me." Graham gave a thin smile. "True, I called you here because we both know where this leads if it keeps going. More hearings, more headlines, congressional subpoenas flying like campaign flyers, and eventually things we can't control." JD leaned forward slightly. "Such as?" Graham's tone never shifted. "Markets, trade partners, cyber defense allocations, maybe even diplomatic standing. You've turned a contract dispute into a national security reckoning." He sipped his drink. "And don't get me wrong, it needed to happen. Wexler got sloppy, arrogant. Someone had to slap him back. You did that, and the public heard you." He placed the glass down gently. "So now, let's move on." JD raised an eyebrow. "Just like that?" Graham nodded. "We help shift the focus. You get new committee support. We fast-track that infrastructure bill you've been sitting on. You stay relevant, respected, and intact." "In exchange for what?" Graham didn't flinch. "You let this hearing stand as it is. No follow-ups, no deeper audits. Let the country have its outrage. Then we get back to governing." JD sat still for a moment. The hum of an old fluorescent light filled the silence. He looked at the untouched glass on the table, then at Graham. "That's the offer?" Graham smiled again. "That's the ladder, JD. The one people climb when they learn how Washington works." JD exhaled slowly, then stood. "I didn't come here to play dodgeball with the truth, Senator." Graham's smile faded just slightly. "I came here," JD continued, "because someone has to remind this place what accountability sounds like. I read one sentence out loud, and the whole machine panicked. That tells me we're nowhere near done." Graham's voice lowered. "This could ruin you." JD reached for the door handle. "Then at least it'll ruin the version of me they were hoping I'd become." He walked out, not looking back. Outside the room, the hallway was dim and empty, the kind of quiet that usually came after business hours. Except JD knew now that real business rarely happened before sunset. Back in his office, Emily was waiting. "Did they offer you anything?" JD nodded. "Everything. And..." He loosened his tie and dropped the envelope Graham had given him onto the desk. "Told them no." She nodded, unsurprised. "Good. Then they'll come harder now." JD looked out the window. The Capitol dome stood in shadow, outlined by streetlights and the cold glow of power pretending to rest. "Let them," he said. "We're not done." The message arrived 2 days after the hearing. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't routed through an alias or buried in metadata. It came as a simple PDF attachment in an email from a dummy account, with no subject line, no signature, just the rawness of someone who no longer had anything to protect except the truth itself. Emily found it first. She stood in the doorway of JD's office, tablet in hand. "We just got something," she said. "From her." JD looked up from his notes. He didn't need to ask who she meant. He gestured for the tablet. The message was short, just under 200 words, but it read like a confession, a testimony, and a reckoning all at once. "I was told never to question the routing architecture. I was told we weren't qualified to understand the national implications. That our job was to make systems run, not ask who else might be watching. But the truth sat in every code string, every exception log, every clause no one read because they were never supposed to. I watched people get promoted for staying quiet. I watched silence become a requirement, not a coincidence. I did this because no one else dared. Thank you, Senator Vance, for giving the silence a sound. JD read it twice, and then again, slower. He sat still in his chair, the hum of the air vent overhead the only sound in the room. Outside the window, dusk was folding gently over Washington. The city was still loud. Horns, headlines, outrage on cable news. But this was the quiet that mattered. He turned in his chair and stared out at the Capitol. From here, it didn't look grand. It looked human. Brick and marble resting on decisions made and not made. And somehow this email, from a woman in hiding, said more about accountability than 100 statements from lawmakers. One crack, he murmured, almost to himself, and they start listening. Emily sat across from him now. She knew the risk. Sending this. She's not running. She's still fighting, just from the shadows. JD nodded. That's where most fights start. He stood, walked over to the window, and pressed his hand lightly against the glass. Somewhere below, tourists were snapping pictures in front of the reflecting pool. Somewhere further out, Wexler's team was likely drafting their next statement, working with crisis managers to reshape the narrative. But for now, for this sliver of time, the truth had a foothold, and someone whose name would likely never appear on a headline had given the country a moment of clarity. He handed the tablet back to Emily. We protect her. We will. Even if they start pressing charges? JD looked back at her. Especially then. He returned to his desk and sat down, pulling out a blank sheet of stationery. For a long moment, he didn't write anything, just sat with the echo of her words, letting them settle into the gravity of what came next. Then finally he scribbled one line across the top of the page. Let them call it noise. It started as a whisper. By the end of the week, the numbers came in. JD's approval rating had dropped 5 points, 3 in swing districts, 2 among moderates. Headlines used words like divisive, reckless, and the one that always made the rounds whenever someone told an uncomfortable truth, grandstanding. Cable pundits recycled the same phrases in rotating tones of concern. He's playing with fire. This is about ego, not ethics. Is Senator Vance just auditioning for a bigger stage? One op-ed in a national paper framed it more directly. Truth is a noble thing, but so is strategy, and Vance may not know the difference. His office phone rang nonstop, not with support but with nervous distance. Donors hesitated. Committee chairs who once praised his transparency suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Even colleagues who'd backed him privately began softening their stance in public. But it wasn't the headlines or the calls that JD noticed first. It was the silence in the hallway. Where there used to be nods, now there were glances that looked past him. Conversations paused as he walked by. The machine had taken notice, and it had begun to insulate itself. And yet, something else was happening too. The letters began to arrive. Not by the dozen, but by the hundreds. They didn't come from lobbyists or high-dollar contributors. They came from veterans, welders, teachers, small business owners, handwritten, typed, scribbled in the margins of envelopes because people couldn't wait to find a second sheet of paper. One from Toledo, Ohio read, I don't know what half those contracts meant, but I knew the silence was wrong. Finally, someone said it out loud. A retired truck driver from Pennsylvania wrote, I hauled routers to one of those data centers 2 years ago. I knew something felt off when we weren't allowed to unload without our phones being locked in a box. A mother from Texas sent a photo of her son in uniform with a note taped to the back. He fights for the flag. Thank you for fighting for what flies under it. JD read every one. Some he kept in a folder. Others he pinned to the inside of his cabinet drawer, where he could see them before every vote. Emily brought him a new stack each morning. Still going, she'd say, almost like a quiet rebellion against the noise outside. On Friday evening, as another headline labeled him politically naive, JD stood by his office window. The Capitol was lit in gold beneath the rising dark. Below, people moved about their lives, laughing, walking, unaware of the power games being waged above them. Let them run their polls, he said quietly. I'll read the letters. Behind him, the headlines blared on a muted screen. But it was the paper in his hands, creased, ink-smudged, and honest, that reminded him what truth sounded like when no one was listening. And now that it had been heard, there was no going back. The stack that morning was thinner than usual, just 17 letters. But Emily handed them to JD with the same care she always did, placing them beside his coffee as the city began to stir beyond the office window. He thumbed through them slowly, his eyes still heavy from a night spent answering emails and fending off the latest round of media spin. A few were thank yous. A few were warnings. One included a hand-drawn sketch of a bald eagle, complete with crayon-colored stripes and shaky stars. And then he found it, a plain white envelope, no return address. Just a smudged postmark from Delaware, and handwriting that looked like it had once been sharp, now worn down by time or arthritis, or both. Inside was a single page, thick stock, no signature, just a typed paragraph, centered and clean. I served 23 years in the U.S. Navy. I was trained to defend this country with weapons. Sometimes those weapons were submarines. Sometimes they were radar. Sometimes they were silence. I watched governments bluff and blink. I watched enemies hide behind treaties. But every once in a while, someone did the hard thing. Said the quiet part out loud. You did that, not with force, with a sentence. Keep going. JD read it twice. The first time, as a senator. The second, as a son, a husband, and the kind of man who still wondered, late at night, alone in his study, whether doing the right thing would ever be enough to outweigh the wrong it disturbed. He folded the letter slowly, precisely, and set it on the windowsill next to the photo of his family. Outside, the Capitol was wrapped in soft winter haze, its columns half lit by the rising sun. For all the voices trying to shout him down, this one, measured, anonymous, unwavering, rang louder than all of them. Emily entered a minute later, briefing binder in hand. The networks want you again tonight. You can say no. JD shook his head. I don't need airtime. He looked back toward the folded letter. I've already been heard. The moment passed quietly like a shift in wind. He tucked the letter into the inside pocket of his blazer. Not for display, not for dramatics, but as armor. Not against bullets or bills, but against doubt. Some battles weren't fought in headlines. Some were won the moment someone dared to speak without flinching. The marble floors of the Senate corridor echoed faintly beneath JD's steps. It was early. Too early for cameras, but not for whispers. Staffers passed with folders clutched and eyes cast downward, each buried in their own swirl of policies and politics. He had just come from a quiet meeting on data privacy amendments, still holding his notes when he noticed someone standing still near the doorway. Rigid posture, shifting from one foot to the other. The young staffer couldn't have been more than 24, neatly dressed, ID badge clipped to his belt. Nervous. JD gave a polite nod as he passed, but the voice came out, shaky, barely above a whisper. Senator Vance. JD stopped. The young man cleared his throat. Sorry, He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. My dad worked for one of the companies Wexler outsourced. Cloud River. He was laid off 4 months before retirement. JD turned fully, giving him his full attention. The young man continued, voice tight with emotion. He used to be proud. Even when things got bad, he still wore the company jacket like it meant something. But when they shut down the plant and moved it all overseas, he stopped talking. Wouldn't even watch the news anymore. JD's face softened. He didn't interrupt. The staffer looked down, gripping the tablet in his hands a little too tightly. When you said it wasn't just business, that it was betrayal, he cried. First time I'd seen him do that in years. There was a silence. Not the heavy kind that suffocates, but the respectful kind. The kind that lets truth breathe. JD nodded slowly. What's your name? Eli. Well, Eli, JD said, his voice steady, warm. Your dad wasn't invisible, and neither were the people they thought wouldn't speak up. What happened to him was real. What they did was real. That's why we do it. Eli blinked fast, swallowed hard, then managed a small smile. Thank you, sir, for saying it out loud. JD rested a hand briefly on his shoulder. Sometimes that's the only way the silence ever ends. He walked on, the sound of his shoes growing quieter with each step down the corridor. Behind him, Eli stood still for a few seconds longer, lighter somehow, as if a burden passed down through economics and politics and corporate spin had been seen, even for just a moment. In JD's Senate office, where most walls are draped in flags and formal portraits, one frame stands alone. Hung deliberately at eye level, it captures a moment no one expected to be frozen in time. Daniel Wexler mid-sentence, his mouth parted, his eyes wide, fingers gripping the microphone as if holding on to the last thread of a narrative unraveling in front of millions. The image doesn't scream. It doesn't need to. Beneath the photo is a plaque, carved from oak by a Kentucky woodworker JD once met during a campaign stop. The words are simple, seared with quiet rage and righteous finality. They sold silence. He answered with a sentence. People entering the room always pause at that wall. Some glance away, some whisper, a few nod slowly, the way people do when they're not sure whether to feel pride or pain. For JD, it isn't a trophy, it's a warning of how close they came to never knowing, of what it cost just to be heard. A few aides had questioned whether it was too provocative. One even asked, shouldn't we frame a legislative victory instead? JD had only said, that was the moment everything else became possible. And that was it. Outside his office, the buzz of Capitol Hill moves on. Inside, that frame holds still, refusing to be edited, ignored, or torn down. The journalist was young, barely out of grad school, and had waited over a year for this sit-down. JD had turned down every major network, declined cable debates, ignored offers from book agents and documentary producers. But something about this journalist's handwritten request, mailed in a stamped envelope, caught his eye. Maybe it was the sentence, I'm not interested in what it meant to the headlines. I want to know what it meant to you. The camera crew kept it minimal. 2 lights, 1 mic, a single cup of black coffee between them. The Capitol stood quietly behind the window, as if listening. She leaned in. Senator Vance, you lost millions in donor funding, made enemies in Silicon Valley, got death threats. You even had to move your family once. Let me ask you plainly, was it worth it? JD didn't blink. Yes, she pressed gently. Why? He looked past the camera for a second, then back at her. If keeping your integrity costs everything, then everything was too cheap to keep. There was a long silence, the kind that doesn't need follow-up questions. Just air, just time. She asked no more. As they packed up, JD handed her something. A photocopy of the whistleblower's original note, the one that ended with, "Thank you for giving the silence a sound." He added quietly, "This wasn't about a scandal. It was about stopping the idea that some truths are too inconvenient to say out loud." She nodded, suddenly aware she wasn't just recording a moment. She was helping archive a stand. In a small high school in central Ohio, where most classrooms still use old projectors and battered civics textbooks, one teacher does things differently. Ms. Callahan, known for her firm voice and soft eyes, wheels in a flat screen and cues up the clip. The students lean forward whispering. On screen, JD Vance stands in a crowded hearing. Wexler freezes. The words ring again, even years later. This wasn't just oversight. It was betrayal, funded by silence. When the clip ends, there's a hush. Not because they're confused, but because they understood it without needing to be told. A girl in the back, wearing a faded hoodie and chewing a pen cap, raises her hand. Did they ever fix it? Miss Callahan pauses, then smiles. The kind of smile that carries both warning and hope. One man cracked it open. Now it's our job to keep it open. The students don't speak right away. Some glance at each other. Some take notes. One kid, who hadn't said a word all semester, scribbles something on a post-it and sticks it to his notebook. It reads, "They tried to sell silence. But someone paid it back in truth." After class, a boy lingers behind. "Ms. Callahan, do you think one voice really matters?" She looks at him, unflinching. "If it's the voice that finally says what everyone else is afraid to, then yes." That voice becomes a mirror, and mirrors change people. Outside, the hallway is filled with lockers, chatter, and the scraping sound of sneakers on tile. But inside that room, Something small has shifted. A weight lifted, a question passed on. Because legacy isn't declared, it's remembered, and it lives quietly in the moments that refuse to stay silent. This story isn't just about political courage. It's about the quiet force of integrity when everything around you rewards silence. J.D. Vance's stand reminds us that sometimes the greatest impact doesn't come from shouting louder, but from refusing to back down when the truth is inconvenient. He didn't fight for applause. He fought to make sure that betrayal wrapped in legality couldn't hide forever. What strikes me most is how one sentence delivered with conviction can ripple through classrooms, homes, and hearts, long after the cameras stop rolling. That's what legacy looks like. Not the fame you collect, but the questions you leave behind for others to answer. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Has there ever been a moment when staying silent felt wrong, even if speaking up came with a cost? What did you choose? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.